Unfortunately, there's a lot of stereotyping around what good cross-cultural communication is. People tend to get a bit hung up on chopsticks and manners and desperately being concerned about not causing offence. Whereas actually, that's rarely the issue. I've in all my 20 plus years and working with thousands of people in multiple organisations, table manners is the least of your concerns. Ultimately, being effective is what it's all about. So it's being able to connect, communicate and collaborate with people who may have different worldviews, different life experience and different backgrounds to yourself. And the interesting thing is that those skills actually are equally relevant in Australia, where 1 in 2 people were born overseas or have an overseas born parent. And we have, unless you're one of Australia's first people, we're a country of migrants. So Australia is incredibly multicultural as well. So these skills cut across. And it's really about, I can go into more depth about it, but there's a lot more to it than just manners of not causing offence. The challenge of reducing culture to a checklist of do's and don'ts is it's just not possible to do that. Like if you think about, sometimes the best way of testing whether something's valid or possible is to reverse it. So if in Australia, for example, you think about what would be on the top 10 things that you'd have to do when you communicate with Australians, like to communicate with you or with me. It's pretty hard to say what 10 things. It depends on people's personality, their background, their profession. So we have to be really careful about reducing everything to such simple levels. What we've found in terms of capability, and this is over years of research and practice in this space, is we've actually developed a model around what effectiveness looks like. And we call it the APKC model. And what we focus on is, first of all, you have to have awareness. So cultural awareness is important, but by itself, it's not enough. So, if you're just aware of something, but you don't know how to do it, you're not going to be effective. So awareness is the first step. Perspective is the second. So A and then P for perspective. You need the capacity to shift perspective. So to be able to understand, well, this is what it looks like from my perspective. How might it look from a different perspective? That capacity to recognize that your perspective is not universal. Everyone doesn't share that. To be able to access and respect that there's diversity and a plethora of perspectives out there is really important. So awareness, perspective, then knowledge. You need to have the capacity to access and apply relevant knowledge. That said, you don't have to know everything and you never will. This is the risk sometimes with cross-cultural communication, is people think, if I know everything, it'll be fine. But even in your own culture, people can know a lot but not be good communicators. So the final piece is capability, and that's the landing point. And that's what's most significant when you move through that cycle of awareness, perspective and knowledge. Then capability, can you actually do it? Do you have the ability to connect with people, to communicate effectively, to convey what it is you want, and also to understand the messages that are coming back to you? So ultimately, it's about whether you can do something. It's not just about knowing it. It's not just about hearing other people, and it's not just about awareness. It's actually about capability. Awareness is the first step, and I'd argue that you need self-awareness, but you also need situational awareness. So an example of that in terms of self-awareness, one thing that we find sometimes challenging for Australians is they don't realise that they have a culture. And it's a critical element of self-awareness to recognise that when there's two people engaging and interacting, there's at least two cultures at play. No one is culturally neutral, and culture's not this weird thing that other people have that you have to learn how not to offend. So the first step of self-awareness is actually being aware of your culture, and also what are the extremes of that culture. What we find is we work with a lot of people who work in really complex global teams. So they may be working in a team with people from 10, 15 different countries. They may be living in their second or third country and maybe speaking their second or third language. So it's really important for you to be aware of what you bring, Because sometimes when we have self-awareness, we can know what is it we need to tone down and what is it we need to tone up. So that self-awareness is really critically important in terms of knowing what you bring and that you have an impact and you have the capacity to adapt. One of the things that is really important when we work across cultures is to recognise not only are we moving across cultures, but who needs to adapt and how much is really important. So in terms of cultural neutrality, often certain people can have the luxury of thinking their culture is normal and they don't need to adapt. So sometimes, for example, when we work with really senior expatriates, they'll be posted to Southeast Asia and they're already at a very senior level. And for those people, it's possible for them to say, I've never had a problem. No one's ever told me that they don't understand me. I just find being myself is all that's required. But when you actually observe that person, they may speak in a lot of slang. You might find, like if I'm listening in Thai, that locals don't understand them. The challenge is when you're moving into a hierarchy, people may not give you that feedback up. So this is why it's so important that we move across cultures at a younger age as well, and we have peer relationships, that your first encounter with working with a different culture isn't in an environment where everyone's being so polite to you, they won't tell you they don't understand you. So it's really important that we engage and we enable that feedback, because sometimes people can be really quite, not naive, but they just don't necessarily realise that locals don't understand them, because no one will say, I don't understand what you're saying. And particularly with the sensitivities in Southeast Asia around being polite, is that people will often smile and say yes, even when they mean no. And if someone explains something and it's not understood, it's less likely that people will say, sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you please explain it again? Or can you tell me more about that? So this is one of the challenges, is how do we enable that two-way feedback so that we're really creating a shared sense of understanding and meaning. So we do lots of work with global teams, and we often go in and do needs analysis confidentially in advance, which is really interesting. So we find out, well, what do you think is going on, and what do you think is going on, and we help teams work through some of those challenges. And often what we find is it's just misunderstandings, and it's different ways of communicating and different ways of developing rapport. A couple of the key things that we see, particularly with Australians involved in diverse teams, is that Australians often have a very unusual way of developing respect and attitudes towards hierarchy. So they tend to treat everyone the same. They tend to make fun of each other as a way of developing rapport. And that's not universal. It's not necessarily appreciated or understood in many different contexts. So with global teams, so with that example, what we'll often do is we'll work with the Australians to help them understand how they might need to demonstrate respect for hierarchy in a different cultural context. But equally, so for example, my background's Thailand, and I've done a lot of work with Thailand, with local staff working with international teams and international management. And in a Thai context, the challenge is to speak up a little bit more and be more explicit. Because if you're alluding to something, people who aren't from high context cultures, like Australians, won't get the hint. So you need to be more explicit. So when we work with diverse teams, everyone needs to shift a little bit to meet in the middle. So it might mean some people need to speak up. It may mean that other people need to learn how to be quiet and listen more. So it's making sure everyone adapts a little. And the other thing that's really important is that the team has a shared sense of protocols around how they communicate. So what is it? What is the way we communicate? So that's some of the work we often do, is we'll go to different countries and work with global teams and say, well, what's working, what's not? How could we communicate more effectively, and help the teams work that out? So there's different, and each team's unique. You know, some teams prefer to use WhatsApp, Others might use Line, might use WeChat. So it's different ways of communicating that work. The biggest lesson learned really is that people are genuinely well-intentioned. People want to work together. People want to communicate and collaborate. They want to get on. People don't wake up in the morning thinking, how can I destroy my team and be really rude to everybody? So good intent is genuinely there. So it's how do we actually step back a little bit sometimes when we might get a bit offended or think that someone's done something in a bit of a strange way, and take a step back. And a model we have is the SURF model. So to stop and suspend judgment is the first step. Use your observation and listening skills. So what's actually going on here? So once you've suspended judgment, and the judgments are so consistent, it's like, I can't believe they did that. It's so disrespectful, or it's so rude. And it's like, well, stop and suspend judgment. What's really going on? Oh, someone arrived 10 minutes after the scheduled start time. Does that mean they disrespect you, or does it mean that they arrived 10 minutes after the start time? So use your observation and listening skills. Does that happen in every meeting? Well, maybe that's a pattern. It might not be about you. Recognize and respect difference. So looking for patterns, being aware, what are the ways we do things around here, which is ultimately what culture is. What are the protocols about time, about expectations of getting back to people? And then find common ground and be flexible. So how do you connect with other people? And ultimately, we're all people. We want to connect. So how do you find common ground and then be a little flexible, give a little in your approach? So SURF, stop and suspend judgment, use your observation and listening skills, recognize and respect difference, find common ground and be flexible. If everyone did that, it'd be much easier. So in terms of mistakes, I think mistake seems a bit harsh. I think it's just misunderstandings tends to be more common. And it's often misunderstandings where people don't understand the difference in another cultural context because they assume everything's the same as their home country. And one of the things that we find a little more difficult these days is because a lot of the people we work with can fly on the same airline, stay in the same hotel chain, read the same social media, have the same thing for breakfast, basically. It means that they don't realise that beneath the surface, they may be in quite a different system, attitudes towards religion, towards governance, towards politics, towards what a meeting's for, towards how you communicate with other people to develop rapport. Those things can be very different. But because things may look similar on the surface, often people will assume that everything is the same. So that's one of the things just to be careful of, is to actually recognise that people's values and beliefs are products of their language, their culture, their history, and it's really interesting once you start learning more about that. Inclusive environment. And ultimately, it's enabling people to contribute what they know and to flourish and bring their whole self to work. So to bring their backgrounds, bring their knowledge. And this is where, with the diversity of the Australian population, if we're better tapped into our diversity, imagine how extraordinarily innovative our businesses could be. Because what we know is diversity plus inclusion can result in extraordinary creativity, innovation, and agility. But if you have diversity without inclusion, you can end up with conflict, dysfunction, and miscommunication. So that inclusion piece is actually critically important to enable people to feel they belong, and that's everybody. Sorry, if I can just add one more thing, is that within diverse teams, inclusion is really important in that one of the differentiators we know with high-performing diverse teams is that there's an atmosphere of what's called psychological safety. So that means trust. So it's interesting, when you trust other people, you're often willing to be a bit more vulnerable. You're willing to make mistakes. You're willing to open up and get feedback. You're willing to give people the benefit of the doubt if they make mistakes. So this idea of building relationships and trust is actually critically important within diverse teams. I think to speak up, particularly if you're working with Australians, and all the research shows us that Australians, even compared to other Western countries, so Americans can find us quite direct, people in the UK as well, Australians tend to be very direct in that they say what they think. Now the challenge is, and when I say Australians, it tends to be more Anglo-Australians who think this. Aboriginal Indigenous Australians tend to be less direct. So it's Anglo-Australians who often expect that people from Southeast Asia, if you have something to say, you'll say it. And you'll speak up in a meeting, for example, or you will challenge someone if you disagree. Now, that's not universal, but that's often Australians, Anglo-Australians, not understanding the way the rest of the world works, that's not universal. You know, even in the US, that doesn't tend to happen. So if you want to be heard, sometimes it's actually being more explicit about what you think. And it can be really challenging to do that. So I think speak up, add your voice would be one of the key things I would say, because the challenge is if people don't listen subtly for the cues, you won't get a word in. So to speak up and add and contribute what you know, particularly in relation to the countries you're most familiar with. There's so much that we need to share and learn from one another, but that can't happen unless people are really comfortable to speak up. The other thing I'd say is that reach out and build relationships, and that needs to be all of us, so a cross-cultural difference. So how do we connect? The other thing too is to not be afraid of making mistakes and not knowing everything. No one is perfect, and inevitably we're sometimes going to get it wrong, but we need to keep trying, and it's an endless journey. So to put yourself out there, share what you think, is really helpful. So the piece of advice I'd give to young people wanting to work between Southeast Asia and Australia is persist. My passion for Southeast Asia made me want to work in this space, and honestly, to build my company and be doing what I'm doing now I was a waitress. I did basically every job I could do to gather the breadth of skills. So to become a trainer, I basically trained people in everything. I worked in call center training to start off with, to learn about communication skills training. I traveled around Australia working with really difficult, resistant groups to learn how to handle groups. So it's just think about what you're passionate about, start doing it, realize that it's endless practice. Persistence is critical. I don't know if you ever get there. You have good days and bad days, and you have to keep trying, but it is worth it. It is so joyous working across the countries of Southeast Asia and Australia, and the food's fantastic as well. So I'd say stick with it, enjoy the journey, and enjoy the friends you make along the way, because there's some incredible people who you'll meet on the journey. So good luck, and persist, keep going. And reach out for help too. If you need help, don't be shy to ask for it.